Well, happy Easter, everybody. We made it. Sunday morning. So glad you guys could be here to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus with us, celebrate what I believe to be the most important event in all of human history. The Apostle Paul, writing in our New Testaments to a church in Corinth, talked about how paramount the resurrection of Jesus was. And he said this in 1 Corinthians. He said, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless. And some of you guys are like, Joel, your preaching is usually useless. But anyway, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith, is what he said. He said that this is the ball game. This is the Super Bowl. If Jesus had not walked out of that tomb, then we are all wasting our time getting up and putting on our pastels and taking the cute pictures with our kids. Like, it's all a waste if Jesus did not walk out of that tomb. But if he did, all bets are off. Anything is possible. This means that there is life and hope and new beginnings possible for every single person. And I want you to be able to believe and trust in the historical resurrection of Jesus. Something I love about Christianity is that this is a historical faith. It's not based on just some writings or somebody's thoughts, but it's based on an event, and that event is the resurrection of Jesus. And we can trust that this happened in human history. A couple of reasons I want to give us that we can trust the resurrection. The first witnesses to the empty tomb and to the bodily resurrection of Jesus were women. And in the first century patriarchal culture, a woman's testimony in a Roman court was not even considered valid. Nobody believed the testimony of a woman. And I know that's sexist, and I know we've come a long way, and we've got a long way to go, but that was the world of Jesus. Invalid testimony of a woman. So why then, if people were making up these stories of the resurrection, would they report that the first witnesses were women? The only reason they do that is because it actually happened. Women were the first witnesses and the first preachers of the resurrection of Jesus. Something actually happened. Oftentimes I ask myself, who's benefiting from a story, right? Like, who's actually winning? And it would make sense that if the resurrection of Jesus was a made-up ploy by some people, that the people that are telling the story, they would benefit from it, right? That the disciples who are telling the story that Jesus is resurrected and he is Lord, you'd think that they had like a nice little beach house on the Galilee, right? Or they had like a nice little nest egg and they're just like holding up, having a good time, right? That's not the case. Church history tells us that almost every one of Jesus' disciples was brutally murdered at the hands of the Roman Empire or ended their lives penniless. They didn't win by propagating a story. They lost because they believed that they saw with their own eyes that Jesus walked out of that tomb because something happened. And maybe for me, what just stops me in my tracks in my hope and my trust in the event of the resurrection is Jesus' half-brother James. Now, during Jesus, his ministry, his 3 years of his teaching and healing and proclaiming this message of the kingdom of God ministry, his brother James was nowhere to be found. But something curious happens after the death of Jesus and after Jesus' disciples start reporting the resurrection of Jesus. James is thrust into the center of this early church movement. He becomes a leader of the early church. He writes a New Testament letter to Christians everywhere. And in the very first verses of the book of James, creatively titled because James wrote it, James says this, Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior. Let me ask you this. What would it take for you to call your sibling your Lord? It would take nothing less than a resurrection because Jesus actually walked out of that tomb. And I want you to have confidence that you can trust that our faith is a historical faith, something that happened in human history. And there are more first eyewitnesses than many other things that we consider fact in human history to the resurrection. But I also know this to be true, that just because you believe something as a fact, oftentimes it doesn't actually change our lives and how we live our lives. We can believe something in our heads and agree with something, but it doesn't shape our lives. It doesn't move how we live day to day. I know this because the speed limit around 465 around Indianapolis is 55 miles per hour. But ain't nobody got time for that, right? Like nobody's actually driving 55 miles per hour. I know this because for me, one of the greatest delicacies ever created is the J. Edwards chocolate-covered potato chip, like sweet and salty. It's like the greatest thing ever. Try not to just eat them all in one sitting. That's my kind of thing, right? I love that so much. And I believe in my head that like, this is bad for me. This is not going to end well. I'm going to feel sick. This is not good for me at all. But I'm more trusting in how great this is going to taste as it's going down, right? I'm thinking about that. I know this because I know and I believe in my mind that LeBron James is almost 40 years old, the oldest player in the NBA, and I know he's so at the twilight of his career, but if the Pacers play him and the Lakers in a 7-game series, like I have no confidence that the Pacers are going to pull this out because I've been hurt so many times by LeBron James. I hate him, respect him, but I hate him so much, right? There's a difference between just believing something in your mind and leaning your life up against it and having confidence in it and trusting it to be true. And this is interesting when we talk about believing things around the Bible, because when we think in our culture about belief, we often think about this. Belief in our Western American minds is about intellectual agreement. That I believe 2 + 2 = 4. I believe that the Beatles are the greatest band of all time, full stop. That is a fact, right? And we think that we just agree with the fact. But what's interesting is that our Bibles aren't written by Western minds and Western people. They're Jewish people. They're with an Eastern mindset. And in the Jewish mind, this is what belief is. Belief in the Jewish mind is about trust. It's a relational idea. It's about confidence in the promises of somebody. It's about confidence and trust that what they say is going to come to be. And we trust in the Jewish mind is like a chair where you can like know all the facts about a chair and how much you paid on Amazon for a chair. But like that's not really belief. Belief in the Jewish mind is sitting down on the chair and leaning your life up against it. And it's an interesting question for us, and I know last Easter we spent a lot of time on this question. Do you believe in the resurrection? Like, do you believe this actually happened in human history? And that's a great question. I want to take us to another question, perhaps a deeper, more personal question for each and every one of us this Resurrection Sunday, and it's this. Do you trust the resurrected King Jesus? Not, do you have this intellectual exercise of, yeah, I've seen the facts, I've seen what people believe, and so I guess I do believe that Jesus walked out of that tomb. But I want to move it to that Eastern Jewish understanding of belief, of trust. Do you trust the resurrected Jesus? Do you lean your life up against his promises, his reality, and the world that he is building in a personal way? Because you see, in the very first Easter accounts that we have at the end of the Gospels, it wasn't about an intellectual assent. It wasn't about just knowing something in our minds. It was about this rediscovery of hope and a banking of our trust and our confidence in this Jesus as he intersected with the darkest moments of his disciples' lives. I want to take us there in John chapter 20. John, one of Jesus' disciples who wrote these things down so that we would have confidence and trust in this Jesus. At the end of his biography of Jesus' life, he says this. Early on the first day of the week, on that very first Easter Sunday, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. Now, in the book of John, John always refers to himself as, the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved, because he had a self-confidence issue. I don't think so at all. He might have had a pride issue, but he was the one that Jesus loved. And this is what Mary Magdalene said. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. At this point, they're not thinking about a resurrection. They had just been traumatized by seeing their rabbi, their leader, their friend Jesus be brutally tortured and hung on a cross and where he died. And they think that somebody has actually taken the body of Jesus. We're told this next. So Peter and the other disciple, John, started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. What an interesting detail if you're the one writing down this gospel account, right? Basically saying Peter was slow and I am fast. I just want everybody to know for all of history, I am faster than Peter. He is really slow. He's got no game. And then we're told this, he outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. Finally, the other disciple, John, who had reached the tomb first, just another little nod there, how fast he is, also went inside. And then we're told this. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. They see this whole thing and they think that there had been a grave robber, that Jesus is not resurrected, but Jesus' body has been taken. And think about the trauma layered on top of trauma of seeing their leader, their rabbi, brutally tortured and murdered, and then thinking we can't even pay homage to him. We can't even honor his burial site because they've taken his body. And so the guy disciples, Peter and John, they go back to the upper room that they rented for the week where they had the Last Supper a few days earlier. They had given up. Everybody had left except for Mary Magdalene. And we're told this in the very next verse. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. Only one person remained, and it was Mary Magdalene. Now Mary Magdalene was struck with grief and loss in the spirit of despondency in this moment. She had lost her friend, her rabbi, her Lord Jesus. But this was personal for Mary. The gospel accounts tell us that Mary Magdalene was possessed by 7 evil spirits, which might be a Jewish way of saying she was completely possessed and lost to the ways of life and the world. But then enter into her story Jesus, who spoke her name and spoke life into her and gave her freedom from that evil possession, gave her a community inside of the disciples, a purpose to be part of Jesus's crew, and changed everything for her. And it was all gone because Jesus was dead. The tomb was empty. There's not even a body there. She's at the end of her rope. I wonder, as you take stock over your last year, my friends, when you think about Easter today, is this a tough one for you? Maybe for you, you're struck with grief and loss in a similar way that Mary Magdalene was. Maybe for you, you think about your Easter dinners and there's going to be an empty seat at the table, an empty chair where somebody's not with us anymore, and that hits you hard. Maybe for you, this is the first Easter where you describe yourself as divorced or estranged or separated. Maybe for you, you're losing and grieving this loss of your kids the way that you always dreamed that they would be, and your relationship with them is not what you wanted it to be. And holidays like this, it brings out all the things as they're not, as they should be. Maybe for you, you're right there with Mary this Easter Sunday, hit with loss and grief. Enter in the resurrected King Jesus to wherever you are. This is what happens next. The very next couple verses, we're told this. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there in the tomb. But she did not realize it was Jesus. Maybe through her tears and through her trauma, she's confused on what's happening. She won't even make eye contact with someone. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, being way off, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." She's so lost in her grief, she can't even tell the goodness in front of her. And then we're told this, the very next verse. Jesus said to her name, Mary. And she turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, her native tongue, Rabboni, which means teacher. It actually goes beyond rabbi and teacher to my great teacher. Everything changed in that moment for her. It was beyond just believing something, but there was a revelation that happened inside of her, because we're told this, that she went to tell the disciples who were cowered in a room together about what had just transpired. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, the word that we see for seen is not just a physical with your eyes seen. It actually carries a connotation of being given a revelation. It's about seeing something beyond just physical and believing something with your mind, but to trusting something, a divine revelation. Maybe for Mary in this moment, she's tying all the dots together of her time with Jesus, where Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, or when Jesus interrupted the funeral of his friend Lazarus, and now seeing Jesus walk out of death. Maybe for Mary, for the first time, she realizes that this Jesus, her rabbi, specializes in interrupting funerals and bringing new life out of dead places. It went from belief to trust for her. I remember as I was just preparing this, thinking about my own loss and grief journey. Many of you know that Back in the fall of 2015, I lost my father, who had been ill for a long time, but we lost him, and he was only 61 years old. And at that time, I had all four of my grandparents that were still living. This is like the first loss that ever really I felt. And I had all four of my grandparents, but then over the next 4 years, between that time and January of 2020, I lost all four of my grandparents, and I was called upon to do many of their funerals and services, and so it just felt like this wave after wave of grief and loss and waiting for the next shoe to drop, and we thought everything was going to chill out, and then we walked into March of 2020, and COVID left me with a whole different sense of grieving and loss of what I thought would be and what actually came to fruition. And it was a tough season that I would not wish on anybody, my worst enemy. But it was during this time that the theology and the reality of the resurrection went from a, hey, look, Jesus at the end goes, hey, I am God, look at this, to this reality of something that I could trust that I needed to take my next step. It was in this time for me that the resurrection of Jesus became a bedrock of hope, that even though the worst things in life hit us, the worst things are never the last things because of the resurrection. And everything sad that hits us in our life because of Jesus walking out of that tomb is in process of becoming untrue. And there's no way around grief, but we can walk through our grief and our loss because we have this mysterious presence of the resurrected Jesus to speak our name and let us know that he is Lord and he is with us and he is over life and death. Let me ask you this question. Do you trust the resurrected King Jesus in your moments of loss and of grief and of pain? It's the invitation this morning is for you to have confidence and lean your life up against the God who walked out of that tomb. Mary is sent next to tell this message to the disciples, and they just don't buy it. They think the women are being hysterical. Oh, there's no way that this is real. And by the way, the men were just cowered up in the upper room, hiding for their lives. This is where, men and women, this is how we hit trauma, right? And so men are acting like there's no big deal, but they're actually scared to death. And we're told this the very next couple verses in the Gospel of John. On the evening of the first day of the week, on the evening of that first Easter, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, we find these guys cowered around a table, the table that they had shared that Last Supper with Jesus, in this room they still had rented. And man, they're scared for their lives. They took Jesus out. They're probably going to come for us next. So there's fear, there's uncertainty, there's a sense of upheaval. We had given our last 3 years to follow this Jesus, and they killed him. It's all over with. The dream is dead, and they find themselves afraid, uncertain, disillusioned with this whole thing because they were for sure that Jesus was the guy and this was what was really happening. And how could this actually come to be? That he's dead and it's all over with. Maybe for you, this Easter, as you take stock on where you are today or in this last year, man, you find yourself right where these disciples were. Struck with fear and uncertainty about what's next for you. Maybe for you, it's again in a relationship that's not where it should be, and it just feels like you're on rocky ground and you're fearful about what's going to happen next. Maybe for you, it's fear about the economy or your job or your industry, or maybe the effects of this upcoming election this year and what that means for you and for your children and for your family. Maybe for you, it's more of a spirit of disillusionment, to where maybe there was some church hurt or some church trauma that you experienced, to where somebody wasn't who they said they were, and there was a system inside of a religious institution that lets you down so much that you want to walk away from the whole thing. I want you to know that you're not alone in that. This is where Jesus' closest friends were on the very first Easter. But then enter Jesus into their story, into their mess. We're told this. Jesus came and stood among them. The resurrected Jesus, somehow with a physical body, but a glorified other spiritual body, gets in through the locked door and said, peace be with you. Now, I don't want us to hear Jesus just goes, oh, peace, deuces, how's it going? Good for you. I don't want us to hear that at all. This phrase, peace be with you, was a loaded phrase to these Jewish men. The word peace means shalom, which doesn't just mean an absence of chaos and destruction. Peace, shalom, meant restoration. meant everything where it should be. It meant chasing out the chaos with order and with mercy and with love. It was a blessing to speak to somebody that you're going to be okay, and it's saying God's good world and his peace and shalom be upon you. Jesus speaks it to these men who are fearful for their lives, and then we're told this. After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Now, it was just this last week that this sort of struck me and jumped off the page to me, but like, why would they be so overjoyed when Jesus showed him his wounds, his scars from the brutality of the torture and the cross? Why would they be overjoyed? On one level, we can think like, oh, that really is Jesus. Look, those are the scars we saw when they did that to you, which I just don't think that's what it was. Perhaps Jesus showing them that he had been through hell on earth, and he had been tortured and beaten and hung on a cross to slowly suffocate. And then Jesus saying, I'm still here. And perhaps if I can make it through this, that you can move forward and have the confidence that you can make it through whatever this life throws at you. This is why they're overjoyed, because Jesus has gone before them and stands in solidarity through whatever they are facing. And maybe it's in this moment that Jesus' words from earlier in the week start to make more sense, and they're taken back and starting to draw these through lines, because Jesus said this. I have told you these things. This is earlier in this week. So that in me, you may have peace. You may have shalom, have order from the middle of your chaos. And then he says, in this world, you will have trouble, which I'm sure his disciples are like, that doesn't sound like peace. That sounds like really bad news, that in this life, in this world, we'll have trouble, that things are not going to go well. There's no peace in that. But then Jesus said this, but take heart, I have overcome the world. I'm sure that when Jesus said this earlier in the week, they thought, that's a nice line, Jesus. You're pretty great. You're pretty powerful. But I'm sure on the other side of his death and his resurrection, these words took root in their hearts and in their souls. And they began to trust not only that the resurrection happened in their mind, but trust the resurrected King Jesus, who had been through it all, and that we don't have to be stuck and paralyzed in our fear anymore. I know it's hard for me to believe as I was considering this the last couple weeks, but the war between Ukraine and Russia has been raging on for over 2 years. It's hard for us to imagine because it doesn't flood our social media feeds anymore. We don't see news reports out of Kiev or Ukraine every day, but there's a war that's been raging on for over 2 years. 31,000 Ukrainians have perished. Cities have been pummeled. Death and destruction in this chaos and hell of war. Earlier this month, I was able to, with our staff, go to Orlando, Florida for a church leadership conference. And on the last morning of the conference, I was just stopped in my tracks from one of the main keynote speakers. He's a pastor by the name of Yaroslav Pish. Yaroslav Pish. And he's a Ukrainian seminary leader and church leader in Ukraine. And he stood up, and it was just amazing that he was there. But the message that he gave was so full of hope and creativity in the midst of the hell that he's had to walk through as a leader and as a Ukrainian man these last couple years. It blew my mind. But he didn't have this spirit of despondency or fear. There was almost this like grin of defiant joy and defiant hope about him, saying that we will get through this because Jesus walked out of the tomb. He was trusting that so much. He spoke about how there have been women and teenagers that were once locked out of doors of leadership in the church of Ukraine that are now stepping in to disciple and share this message of Jesus. He spoke about the mercy ministries and humanitarian ministries that Christians are leading in the country of Ukraine, and the connections and friendships and relationships that they're making with people that would never walk into the doors of a church during normal times. And he spoke about how adversity actually propels them forward to true life, almost like there's life that comes on the other side of death. Yaroslav Pish said this: adversity doesn't just test our faith, it's God's forge for our souls, shaping us into vessels of true significance. As a man who's heard missiles go by his home and his community for weeks and months and years. This is what he says adversity does, but he's doing this because he trusts that Jesus walked out of this tomb. And he trusts the reality of a God who says that in this world you will have trouble, but trust me, take heart, I have overcome the world. My friends, if you're stuck in fear and uncertainty, do you trust the resurrected King Jesus and his words and his promise? That's the invitation for you today. There's one more account of Jesus meeting disciples after his resurrection at the very end of the Gospel of John, and it kicks off here in John chapter 21. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. How would you like to be the two other disciples? Not getting your name in the list, right? Simon Peter says, I'm going out to fish. Simon Peter told them this. Like, he's going out to fish. Now, let me ask you a question. Why is Simon Peter back in the Galilee, and why is he going out fishing? He's going there because the dream is dead. Jesus has been crucified. He skipped out of town. Not only that, Peter actually had this traumatic experience after Jesus, his arrest, to where he actually denied even knowing Jesus. He made eye contact with Jesus, but he said, I don't even know this guy because he's trying to save his own skin. There's a moment where Peter's in the courtyard warming his hands over the coals, and someone's like, do you know Jesus? Weren't you one of his disciples? And Peter's like, nope, don't know the guy, never had anything to do with him. I'm just trying to warm my hands. I mean, this brutal guilt and shame that Peter was holding on to. And so he's out of here. He's going back to Galilee. He's going fishing with his buddies. He's like, the whole dream is done. I'm just going back to my father's trade. Everything is over. But what we're told next is that Jesus is on the shore when they're out in the boat. And Jesus calls to the disciples. They don't recognize him at first, but he's like, hey, come to the shore, basically. And then John says, I realized that was Jesus in the boat. He says, that's the Lord over there. That is Jesus. So Peter reflexively jumps out of the boat, and he's going to swim all the way back to shore. Now, I love to consider what Peter's thinking on that swim. Like at first it was reflexive. Like if that's Jesus, I've got to get back to Jesus. But I wonder during that swim all the way back to the shore if he's like, uh-oh. What am I going to do when I get there? What's Jesus going to do to me when I get to the shore? Is he going to give me a stern talking to? Is he going to shame me and bring back what I had done and just remind me of the shame that I felt because of the way that I denied even knowing him and betrayed my rabbi? What's going to happen when I get to the shore? So he steps out of the water and he starts walking towards Jesus. I imagine he's got so much shame he won't even make eye contact with Jesus. And I just think it's great for us to wonder in this moment and consider ourselves. Maybe for you this Easter, you got dragged here to church by your parents or a partner or a spouse, and you're like, yeah, this isn't for me. I'm like, and you're thinking about like, you've gone way too far. There's no grace for you. There's no forgiveness for you. There's no way that God wants to have anything to do with you. And the only thing you're going to feel walking in here is shame and guilt from on high and to every church person you make eye contact with. Maybe that's your story this morning, to that I say it's very brave that you're still here. But I want you to consider that you're right there with Peter, with your shame and your guilt, not only saying that you've done something bad, but somehow the shame has taken root to where you feel like you are bad. And how does Jesus respond to the shame and the guilt of Peter? We're told this. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it. I just imagine that Peter gets out of the water and he starts to smell the burning coals, and it's even bringing more feelings of guilt and shame up in Peter because he's remembering the burning coals from 3 days prior, how he denied even knowing Jesus. There's a fire of burning coals with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153 to be exact. But even with so many, the net was not torn. And here's the line that changes everything for Peter. And maybe it changes everything for you and your guilt and your shame this morning. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Because breakfast food fixes everything, right? Fish tacos for breakfast, no. Not exactly. But to a Jewish person, to share a table, to share a meal with somebody meant that you and I are good. Our relationship is restored. I want to break bread with you. I want to look at you eye to eye. We are good. You are forgiven. All is forgiven. Come and eat with me. And Jesus initiates this meal that would initiate a conversation saying, Peter, I want to give you the keys to the church to drive this thing into the future. Peter, I believe in you, and life is going to be hard, but I'm going to be with you to the end of the age. You are forgiven. Peter comes face to face with a God who says that you are loved in the middle of your shame and guilt. When I was a junior in high school, there was an event that happened that shaped my life forever, and what I think about God and what I think about guilt and shame. There was a scandalous thing that happened in Kokomo where there was a business leader who had made headlines for doing something wrong, getting in trouble, getting busted for something. And I remember just hearing so many people talk about this at school because he had kids around my age. And I remember thinking, oh, this is so bad, he's going to lose his business. And people were saying, I'm never going back there because of this whole thing. And then I remember going to a church service. It was in an Easter service, and I remember seeing him from the other side of the room, and I'm distracted because I'm like, I can't believe he showed his face here. Oh my gosh, doesn't he feel guilty? I'm just being real with you. Like, I had all those judgmental feelings. Doesn't he feel guilty being here? I can't believe his wife is still with him. I can't believe their kids are right there. I can't believe this. The church service ends, and I'm just full of so much guilt, so much judgmentalism towards this person. And there's this lobby area, and I see one of the pastors of the church on the other side of the room, and I see the person who has been this scandalized person in our community, and it's almost like they make eye contact. And the pastor's like, he's working through a crowd, and he's like moving people out of the way to get to this person. And you see this person who's been full of so much scandal be like, I'm just trying to get out of here. He's trying to get out of the building. The pastor's trying to get to him. He's probably thinking this is going to be this terrible, terrible experience of feeling so much more shame and more guilt. But it's like this pastor was like possessed. I had to get to him. And they finally reach each other. The guy won't even make eye contact with the pastor, but the pastor just embraces him. And I don't know what was said there, but man, there was so much grace and mercy in that conversation that it wrecked me. And I'll never forget it, even though it happened about 20 years ago. This is what Jesus is like. In our guilt and our shame, he runs after us. He comes to us. He's like, we've got to have breakfast. I want this relationship to be restored. This is who Jesus is, my friends. Do you trust this resurrected King Jesus the way that Peter did that morning? You don't have to run. He's right there, and he's chasing after you with his love and his mercy and his forgiveness that was won at the cross for you. Let's come back to these questions that we started with this morning. Do you believe in the resurrection, man? I hope that you trust that Jesus walked out of that tomb. That is a historical event, and it really happened. But the big question I want you to wrestle with today is this. Do you trust the resurrected King Jesus? My brothers and sisters, this Easter morning, may you accept that invitation to trust this resurrected King Jesus, the one who meets you in your grief and your loss. And this mysterious presence says that you are not alone, and that this is not the end. May you trust him, have confidence in him. May you trust the resurrected King Jesus. Go beyond just thinking about it. Trust this resurrected King Jesus. And your fear and your uncertainty and your disillusionment with man-made institutions, may you trust this resurrected King Jesus, that you don't have to stay stuck, but you can trust him and move forward. And he's not done with you. And in your shame and in your guilt, in your past or in your broken, messy present, may you not run from this Jesus, but may you trust the resurrected King Jesus embraces you with mercy and with kindness and compassion. Do you trust this resurrection? Not just do you believe it, but do you trust it? Are you leaning your life up against it? That changes everything.